We're turning a corner now and moving down into the home stretch, sort of, but maybe this is just the far curve. But we have now as a speaker Elizabeth Edgerly. What I gathered by looking through her paragraph is that she's smart. She has a doctor's degree, and so she brings a lot of background and a lot of training to the table. She is the Chief Program Officer for the Alzheimer's Association of Northern California and Nevada. And in talking with her for just a few minutes, what I gathered is that people with Alzheimer's often are in our homes and in our families and in our extended families, and we may not even recognize. I mean, it's kind of a gradual process that people go through, and we may not recognize the trouble that they're having. And I think that a little bit of her talk will be how to recognize when people are beginning to have problems, what are the resources, what are things that we can do to try to assist people, and also that people with Alzheimer's are especially vulnerable to abuse and scam artists and those kinds of things. So this is another opportunity for us to learn, to grow in our understanding of abuse and of people who are abused, and especially of Alzheimer's. So Elizabeth, we're really happy you're here. Thank you so much, and the podium's yours.
Let me just get the slide set. Okay. That's always a good sign when they come up when you want them to. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a beautiful area. What a nice drive, although it was quite rainy, I have to admit. I drove up from San Jose, so I apologize for not being able to hear the earlier speakers, but it's a pleasure to be here to talk with you about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, and that is the care and recognition of people with dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So I guess not having seen other speakers, they have to run back and forth to the...
I would be glad to.
Oh, would you do that for me? Oh, thanks. Great. All right, this is good. So our objectives for today, the first one is I hope that you will gain better understanding of Alzheimer's and dementias. I'm going to talk about some different types of dementia. The reason I'm doing that is because I want us to go away with a clear sense of the kinds of diagnoses, the kinds of situations where someone is going to be especially at risk. And we'll go into that in detail. We're going to look at the specific symptoms and situations that persons with dementia and their caregivers, frankly, are often in, and how that puts them at risk for particular kinds of elder abuse. And then I know you've talked about elder abuse this morning, so I'm going to reinforce that and show you some examples of situations that put people with Alzheimer's at particular risk. So let's go on to the next slide and talk about what is dementia. Let me first ask, how many of you know someone, a family member, a friend who has Alzheimer's or another type of dementia? That's a lot of people. Probably 70%, maybe? So, do you know what the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia is? No, that's probably the most common question I get. And hopefully you'll know the answer to that question by the time I'm done explaining it, because it is very confusing. So let's start with terminology. What is dementia? Well, dementia is a syndrome that describes a group of symptoms. So it's a little bit generic in that it describes that a person is experiencing 5 different types of symptoms. Now, they don't have to have all of them, but everyone with dementia has memory problems. Many people have language difficulties. They have problems with judgment and reasoning, thinking, logic, behavior changes, like wandering behavior. For those of you who raised your hand, I imagine some of you have experience with a friend or family member who had problems where they'd walk out the door and they couldn't find their way back without assistance. And then the last one is personality and mood changes. And what this could be might be that a person who's normally pretty easy to get along with, not very irritable, all of a sudden they seem like they're very frustrated, angry, irritable, using words that they wouldn't have normally used. Sometimes people will say in support groups, they'll say, I didn't even know my mom knew those words, and she's speaking them very clearly. So that's an example of a personality change. Someone who wouldn't have used those words starts using them. The reverse can also happen. Sometimes I've had experience with adult children who say that now their dad is really sweet and kind and wonderful, and everyone in the nursing home thinks he's just the greatest guy. And she paints a different picture of him at a younger age, that he was actually pretty hard to get along with and maybe might have even been abusive to her as a child. So it can go different ways, but more often we hear about people becoming irritable and frustrated. So let's go on to the next. So here's my explanation of the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia. And I like to start with an analogy. If you look at this analogy, you'll see at the top I have the general category of flowers, and we all know there are different types of specific flowers. If you could go to the next slide. Dementia is the same kind of deal. There's the generic category of dementia and the specific types of dementia. So, here's the question. Does everybody with Alzheimer's disease have dementia? Yes. It's a type of dementia. So everybody with Alzheimer's, even if it's really, really early and they're doing really well, they still have dementia. If it's really, really late and they're having a hard time, it's the same dementia. Does everybody with dementia have Alzheimer's disease? No, there are different types. And for our purposes today, frankly, knowing a little bit about the other types is helpful, because people with different types of dementia are at different levels of risk for certain situations. And I know that that's kind of a confusing sentence, but I'll explain that later. So let's go on to the next slide. So in terms of percentages, Alzheimer's clearly represents the biggest pot in terms of dementia, the causes of dementia. So about 60, some estimates even say 70% of people with dementia have Alzheimer's disease. After that comes related disorders, and I'm going to go into these in a little bit, and that would be about 30%, and the last 10% are what we call the reversible conditions or disorders. Let's go on to the next one. So let me start with that last bit, because if I'm experiencing memory problems, if I'm having language difficulties or having a hard time at home, I want to know, frankly, do I have one of these? Because these are more readily treated and reversed than the other types. So that's one of the reasons why we encourage people to get a diagnosis, is if you know you're having problems, wouldn't you want to know if they were entirely reversible, and wouldn't you want to get that treatment? So these are the reversible disorders. The top of my list is depression. Kind of an interesting thing, you may not know this, but older adults, when they experience depression, they have different types of symptoms than younger adults. There's some similarities, but one of the key differences is for some older adults, when they have depression, they look like they have dementia. They can almost look identical. They can have a hard time taking care of themselves, have a hard time concentrating, remembering things. They withdraw. They don't want to be with family and friends. Things start to fall apart around them. Does that kind of sound like dementia to you in terms of what you've seen? Well, sometimes they'll even call it pseudo-dementia, or dementia caused by depression. And this is relatively treatable. It's not like that for everybody, but the medications and psychotherapy and other interventions can be very effective for this. Adverse drug reactions is another thing we want to watch out for. As we get older, our body takes longer to process medications. So let's say you've been taking the same medication for 40 years, and one day you have a problem with it. That can happen for an older adult. You can have been doing fine on a medication, and then, you know what, it's just not going to work anymore. My elderly mother is having that experience. She's been taking a medication, doing fine, and then she ends up having kind of thought disordered symptoms, if you know what I mean, delusional thinking because of medications. This kind of reaction is not unusual. Memory side effects are quite common with some medications that probably most of us in the room are taking, things like over-the-counter antacids, so Pepsid AC, Zantac, and Tagamet. Did you know that that can affect your memory? Other medications, high blood pressure medications. There's a huge list of medications that can affect your memory. So we want to make sure that there's not something going on in this realm. Metabolic changes, in particular thyroid functioning. If you have an underactive thyroid, you can experience serious memory problems. Nutritional deficiencies, in particular vitamin B12 is one that we want to make sure we get enough of, and that you would get through meat, typically. So if you're a vegetarian, you just want to make sure you're getting enough of the B12 vitamins. Brain tumors, on occasion, can be accounting for these symptoms. And we do want to pay attention to sensory loss. Have any of you had this experience where you have a conversation with someone and you can't tell if they were confused because they're confused or because of their hearing loss? I've had that experience so many times. It's hard to separate those two things out sometimes, isn't it? I remember when my husband's grandmother was alive, she died 2 years ago, listening to the end of the telephone that he was on, and I'd hear this conversation, "Grandma, it's me, it's Jimmy. You know, I'm your grandson, it's Jimmy. It's Jimmy, Grandma, not David." And he's screaming it into the phone, and we had a whole conversation. Is she having problems like dementia, or is it her hearing loss? And so we ended up figuring out that it was primarily the hearing loss, and addressing that could help with that situation. The last one is frankly the most important one on this list, in my opinion, and that is that urinary tract infections and upper respiratory infections in an older adult can lead to a situation called delirium, where the person becomes acutely confused. Have any of you seen that before? You've witnessed it? It's really shocking, isn't it, when it happens? One of the things I found was interesting about this was that it can take a little bit of time. Even after the urinary tract infection clears up, the delirium can last maybe as much as 6 weeks. So these are the kinds of things, whenever someone has an abrupt change from doing okay to all of a sudden they look like they have Alzheimer's, something has happened. The first thing to consider is an infection, and to take that person to the doctor and really have them do a workup. So let's go on to the next slide, which is the related disorders. Lewy body dementia. Have any of you ever heard of Lewy body dementia before? This is not as commonly heard of. I was just at a caregiver support group yesterday, and the gentleman's wife had Lewy body dementia, and he described it really well. It looks like a combination of Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease in the same person. So what would you expect that to look like? Well, the person's going to have some memory problems, some language problems, judgment and reasoning difficulties. And what happens in Parkinson's? Some motor difficulties too, right? They may have some of the shaking, they may have some of the rigidity that you'll see in Parkinson's. And some people with Parkinson's end up having what they call kind of a mask-like facial expression, a little bit less responsiveness in their face. And so you can see that. The other major thing with Lewy body dementia is hallucinations. Very common. About 70% of the people with Lewy body dementia have visual hallucinations that are quite vivid, and they're typically not upsetting to the person. So whenever I hear someone say, "Oh, my mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, but you know, lately she's been seeing this little person in her room, and she talks about her and says, 'Didn't you see that little girl? She's just so cute. She comes every day and she'll have a conversation with her, and she's not upset about it at all.'" And how do you think the family members feel about that? You know, what's going on here? The question, boy, is it raining out there, huh? Wow. It's a little distracting. So the key thing that we work with families on is, does it matter if she's seeing things if it doesn't upset her? If she's not upset about seeing a little girl, do we need to medicate it out of her? Hopefully not. If she's upset about it, that's a different situation. But if she's not upset about it, unfortunately, many times the medications we would give someone to help them not have hallucinations is not good for a person with Lewy body dementia. Because Lewy body is like Parkinson's disease, if you give a person Haldol, which is one of those really strong drugs that they would give sometimes for hallucinations, they end up becoming very stiff and unable to move, and it's very dangerous. So why do I tell you this? For those of you who are professionals, I want you to be aware of this diagnosis because it's often missed. And people will end up treating those hallucinations and ending up putting the person at risk. And for those of you who are family members, who are just here because you're interested and you have older family members, or you yourself are concerned about elder abuse, to look at this in your friends and family, because it is often missed, and yet it's a very common dementia. It's the second most common cause. So the next one here is called frontotemporal lobe dementia, and this is one that I think features prominently when we talk about elder abuse and sticky situations. Frontal lobe dementia tends to affect people who are a little bit younger, so they may be in their 50s and early 60s, as opposed to these other dementias which may have a later onset, say in the mid-70s. A person with frontal lobe dementia is affected, this part of their brain right up front is affected. And this part of your brain is responsible for helping you control yourself in public. So if you think about this, think about all the things you would be embarrassed to do in front of another person. And just think about it for a second, okay? You got it in your mind. And know that the front of your brain is what's keeping you from doing that right now, okay? So things like scratching, if you have an itch, or I'm not going to go into all the things that we could possibly be doing, but one of those that I think of, I'm giving you a window into my disturbed mind here. But every once in a while I sing with a woman who wears clothing that's about 2 sizes too small, okay? We've all known people, who do that, and I always have this little running dialogue with myself about her. She's a wonderful person, and I always think, gosh, why don't you just buy him a little bigger, just a little bigger. Now, I would never say that to her. That would be awful. She would be very hurt, and it would be mean for me to say that. People with frontotemporal lobe dementia, boom. Boy, lady, could you fit into anything smaller than that? A real-life example of this was a gentleman with frontotemporal lobe dementia. He was in his 50s. He had a teenage daughter going to her prom. She came down the stairs and said, "Daddy, what do you think?" And he said, "It makes you look a little fat, honey." Again, isn't that one of those things where, boy, you hope you wouldn't even think that about your beautiful teenage daughter, and if you did, you would never say it. Imagine how the relationships are affected in frontotemporal lobe dementia. The other thing is things like shoplifting. Doing things impulsively happens a great deal in frontotemporal lobe dementia. So people may shoplift and not even realize that there's anything wrong with that. Or do something sexual and not realize that there's anything wrong with that. So you can see how these folks get in trouble with the law. So let's go on to the next one, is vascular dementia. Vascular dementia, it keeps changing names. Some of you know of it as multi-infarct dementia, if you've heard of that before. Same thing as vascular dementia, they just keep kind of changing it. And what it is, it's caused by small strokes. You've heard of TIAs, I bet. Transient ischemic events, TIA. Attacks, thank you. Transient ischemic attacks. Now the key word in that is transient or temporary. So a TIA doesn't have a lasting impact. But what happens after you have lots and lots of them? It starts to build up and it can turn into multi-infarct dementia or vascular dementia. So people will experience problems as they have more strokes, and the pattern of behavior or symptoms will vary depending on where the strokes take place. In most instances, these people look a lot like Alzheimer's patients. Other types of dementia, Parkinson's patients can have dementia. About 30% will experience some problems with dementia. AIDS-related dementia, there's some other rare dementias called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. That was the mad cow disease scare that can cause dementia. It's not very common, as you might imagine, but it is a real thing. Let's go on to the next one, and we're going to talk specifically about Alzheimer's and how many people are impacted by Alzheimer's. These are brand new statistics. They were released about 2 weeks ago by the Alzheimer's Association. And what you can see up there is that the risk of developing Alzheimer's increases with age. When we look at 65 to 74-year-olds, we're talking about 2% of the population, which is about 300,000 Americans. When we look at 75 to 84-year-olds, we're talking 19% of the population have dementia, and that represents 2.4 million Americans. And then the last group, 85 and over, 42%. 2.2 million Americans. That's a big percent, isn't it? So what we know is that a lot of elders, unfortunately, do end up having cognitive impairments related to Alzheimer's and dementia, and we need to be aware of that. Now, these numbers have changed a little bit. It used to be that we would say the percentage of people over age 65, it was 1 in 10 had Alzheimer's. It is now 1 in 13. Can you guess why that would be? The aging of the population. There are more people in that 85 and over group. And we also have a lot of baby boomers. Now, this isn't affecting that percentage, but the baby boomers are hitting their 60s, and with that, we're going to have a major increase in the number of people affected. The percentages may change as the people live longer, but in general, we are going to see a much bigger number of people affected by this. So let's look at some pictures of Alzheimer's disease in the brain. Over time, the brain shrinks in a person with Alzheimer's disease and affects a variety of functions. So what you can see up here, the first one is a normal brain. You can see, hopefully you can see it. It's a little small for you, isn't it? It's the one furthest to my right. The next one is one that has advanced Alzheimer's disease. So what's one thing you notice, a big difference between them? The size, right? You can see the difference in the one below. You see major shrinkage in the brain of the person with Alzheimer's disease. The next slide shows it well too. So you can see the difference. On one side you have what would be a normal brain, on the other side you have a brain of a person with Alzheimer's disease. So let me ask you this. Do you think a person who has advanced Alzheimer's disease could hire a contractor, could make a good decision about whether to donate money to a charity? No. Could take a bath independently, not rely on other people? No. All these things, just basic independent living, let alone higher order functions like hiring a contractor, which for those of us who hopefully don't have cognitive impairments, that's a pretty scary thing, isn't it? You know, just imagine how it is for the caregivers who are very stressed and for the person with Alzheimer's disease. Let's look at the progression slides. In this you can see that the brain, it's actually pretty subtle in terms of which parts of the brain are affected first. There's a part in your brain called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is where you take new learning, so hopefully you're picking up some new facts and figures today that you're going to store there for later. Your hippocampus takes that information and it stores it in your brain. That is the first place affected in a person with Alzheimer's disease. So given that, what kinds of memory do you think they would have a hard time with? Memory from a long time ago when they were 4 years old and they used to go to the lake in the summer, or a memory for what they just had for lunch? It's the new stuff, isn't it? That is very confusing to people. I've heard so many times, you know, my sister, she's got some memory problems. She can't remember what she just said. She doesn't know what we just did. She forgets someone she's just met. But she can remember what happened long ago like it happened yesterday. That is a hallmark Alzheimer's kind of a statement. With time, what happens? The memories start to fade and go a little bit further back. And you can see here that more parts of the brain become affected. It starts with the hippocampus. It can move to the frontal lobes. So what's going to happen when those frontal lobes are affected? See some behaviors, right? You'll see some things that maybe poor judgment, inability to reason through things well. Temporal lobes are right behind your ears, and that's where memory, many types of memory are located, and that's where the disease spreads to. And ultimately, as a disease progresses quite a bit, it permeates most of the lobes of the brain. Let's go to the next one. Okay, so what happens as it progresses? We talked about the memory changes. They start with short term, they go to long term. I think of it as if it's like a squeegee going across a windshield. And memory starts getting wiped out, and it's not perfect. There are little bits and pieces of memory that stick, but Eventually, it gets to the point where the person may not recognize their family member and friends, or they may say, when I married my husband, he didn't have gray hair, and now he has a full head of gray hair. I could very easily, if I had Alzheimer's disease, say, gosh, honey, why'd you decide to go gray? You know, why did you dye your hair gray? Or who are you, and why are you in my bed? Those are real examples where people will think it's their father or their father-in-law, not their husband. Have any of you had experiences like that where the person misidentified someone? That can be pretty scary. And let's think about elder abuse again. If you're getting into bed and you think there's a stranger in your bed, is that a potentially risky situation? You betcha it is. And unfortunately, a lot of caregivers experience threats. You know, you get out of here right now. One case that a woman that I met who was living, she and her husband had moved his mother in with them. And the mother believed that her son, the woman's husband, was her husband. So you can imagine what might happen. She would call the daughter, the caregiver, names, you little blank, get away from my husband. She would come into the bedroom and pull her out. Not a good situation. It's hard enough for caregivers, isn't it? For those of you who know what it's like. And so this was a really difficult situation. And one of the things that we worry about at the Alzheimer's Association is premature institutionalization and certainly abuse in the home. And we don't want either. And yet trying to figure out how do we prevent these things from happening is really, really tricky. So the memory changes affect that, not only in terms of forgetting names, but forgetting faces, language problems, word finding difficulties, even just putting together a coherent sentence becomes difficult. So for those of you who are ombudsmen and you're trying to interview someone and find out what happened, good luck with that. You know, that's going to be tough if a person has memory impairment and language impairment. To try to piece together what's going on is really, really difficult. And I commend you all for doing that work. It's hard work. Activities of daily living become a challenge. That's the bottom line. So let's go to the next slide. And this is what I've boiled down to of why people are in particular at risk. The memory loss really puts people at risk. How many times have you gotten something in the mail where you look at it and you think, this looks a little fishy. I don't remember asking for whatever it was. I didn't ask them, or I didn't have a rebate coming to me. I got a check in the mail. Have you had that happen before? You get that check and then you read the small print and it says, if you sign this check, you have signed up for a monthly whatever it is. Or you click on that thing if you're on the internet and it says, do you want to save $10 right now? Click here, click here, click here. And you click there and you're signed up for some monthly thing that you never wanted. So having memory problems where you think, boy, did I ask for that? I don't remember asking for that. Well, okay, I guess I asked for it. And then you end up signing up for something that you don't want. We have worked with some families, in particular people with frontotemporal lobe dementia, where there have been financial issues, and I should get into those in a little bit, but where the judgment problems really make it difficult for the family. The communication difficulties. If you're caring for someone and you're trying to take care of them and address their safety needs, and it's a big fight, you're trying to have the person not drive, and they keep driving, and no matter what you say, you can't convince them not to drive. You can imagine how there's a lot of tension that can happen around that. And that's a dangerous situation. So communication difficulties definitely are an issue. Problems with judgment and reasoning. I think for fiduciary abuse, financial abuse, these are in particular an issue. When you get the call saying, would you like to donate to whatever, or congratulations, you've won the sweepstakes. If you just give us 10% of the money, then we'll send you the whole amount. And so many cognitively intact people fall for that, and you think about how vulnerable this population is. There was one example of a gentleman who gave away so much money that he wiped out the whole savings account for his family before they could get power of attorney on him, and it's Really sad. There was also a situation that we dealt with not far from here where a car dealership, back to the driving issue, a car dealership, the family had very creatively managed to get rid of the car so that Dad wouldn't drive anymore. So Dad, still having a lot of resources, called up the local car dealership and said, I'd like to buy a car. And they came out and picked him up, brought him out to the dealership, sold him a car. He could no longer sign his name, so they helped him sign his name to the paperwork and sent him home. He no longer had a driver's license, he had no insurance, and he paid a huge amount of money for this car. Bad situation, bad situation. So unfortunately, problems with judgment and reasoning are a big issue. Poor hygiene and personal care. Now, why would I have this up here? Why would that put someone at risk? Can you think of any reason? What? Infections. The self-neglect, certainly. I mean, people could get into trouble that way. Any other thing that comes to mind? Have you ever, and I'm going to show you a video in just a little bit, the situation sometimes for families and for professionals around bathing can be pretty dicey sometimes, and I'm going to show you that, and how it could put both the elder and their care provider at risk for violence. Wandering behavior, very dangerous behavior. 60% of people with Alzheimer's or another type of dementia will wander at some time. 60%. And of that group who wanders, 20% will do so repeatedly. Now, here's another statistic. 50% of people who are not found within 24 hours are found dead. So put those two facts together, and it's really scary stuff. We are very strong at intervening with families and facilities when people wander. It is a deadly behavior that we really have to address. Aggression and combativeness, you can see how that can be a problem. Well, I'll give you some examples of that. Hallucinations sometimes are an issue when the person is upset by them and responds to them. And then the strained family relationships kind of set the stage for potential abuse. So let's focus on elder abuse in terms of physical abuse. Now, I understand you've all kind of gone over, okay, what are the different types of abuse? So I'm not going to go into that. What I'm going to do, though, is focus on how this population in particular can be at risk for each of the different types of abuse. And so you know that it could be assault, battery, physical restraints that are unreasonable, deprivation, etc., sexual assault. I'm going to give you some examples of these that we've seen. Here was a situation in a caregiver support group where the caregiver, an elderly woman, I think she was in her 70s, was saying that she was at her wit's end with her husband. He would shadow her. Have you ever heard of that expression? You can picture what it would be. He was constantly with her the whole time. She had no caregiving services. She didn't have any in-home care, and her family wasn't helping her at that point. And she said, I just needed to go to the bank. So I set him down in a chair, and I got some duct tape, and I duct taped him to the chair. And I left, and I just went to go to the bank, and I came back 10 minutes later, and he was sitting there just fine. Is that okay? Absolutely not. Obviously, it's not okay. So, in addition to having to file a report as a result of that disclosure, we worked with her to say, there are lots of other ways to handle this situation. And clearly you need some help. And that's often what we're doing. We work with APS, we make the case. I've started referring to, instead of having the conversation be, I'm sorry, but we have to report you, what I say is, I need to make a referral to an agency that's going to be very helpful, because this situation is not good. So I need to make a referral to this group. I'm going to connect you with a social worker, and she's going to be really helpful, or he's going to be helpful. And it's amazing how much better that sounds than, I have to report you. People are like, oh, okay, great, I can get help. And that's really, in my opinion, what it is. It's help when you clearly need it before something really bad happens. So that was one example. What I want to do now is I'm going to show you a little teeny video clip. And this is a clip that we use for training of professionals in facilities to demonstrate good communication and poor communication with one resident. And I want you to pay attention to the approach that the caregiver has with this woman as she's bathing her. And think about it in the context of our conference here today, elder abuse. And is this the setting for a risky situation, okay? So I want you to watch this first caregiver and look at her approach and look at how the woman is before the person approaches her and how she responds to it. And then I'm going to show you what difference good communication can make, okay?
Addressed, rather than on Margaret, the person, who is uncomfortable and dislikes being done to. Margaret responds by becoming more and more agitated and upset.
Margaret, in the cold darkness, put your black on. I did not. It's cold outside. Let's put this on. Yeah. Come on, let's put this on.
And I think that's a really good point about it's the frustration level. When people get frustrated, they do things. All of us do things when we're frustrated. If you've never cared for someone with Alzheimer's, but you have children, you might, and I'm not saying those two are the same, but as a parent, you certainly had an experience where you got so frustrated, you thought, I need to leave this situation now and get a little bit of a break. Same thing in this situation. When you get too frustrated, people need to take a break. Otherwise, things can happen. We had a situation in Palo Alto, not far from our office. It was a tragic situation of a couple, an elderly couple. The husband had Alzheimer's disease, and he and his wife were living alone in Palo Alto, and nobody knows what happened, but he killed her with a blunt object of some type. It was like a statue or something like that. And he had no memory of it. His son is a police officer, and they were all absolutely devastated. That's the worst scenario I've ever seen. And I've been working for the association 12 years. I think that's the only case I can think of where it was from the person with Alzheimer's who actually ended up killing someone. That's what sometimes people are afraid of, that's going to happen. More often, it's the person caring for the person with Alzheimer's who gets frustrated and duct tapes them to a chair or restrains them in some way or physically hurts them. Could you help me with the slides again? Thank you. So let's go on to the next one, and that is neglect. Now, in Alzheimer's, you can think of the kinds of neglect that people would face. One of the things we worry about in particular when people are in facilities or if they're in the late stages of the disease and living at home are skin disorders, decubiti, things like that. And it's tough. I know it's hard for providers to deal with this, and yet they have to deal with it. You have to have the constant changing and constant moving in order to avoid that, so avoiding bed sores and things like that. Dehydration and malnutrition is a major issue, and for those of you who work in the field, you may know that the state put this as a top priority, that they found that many people living in facilities are malnourished and dehydrated. And part of the challenge for persons with dementia is they may not have the same signals to eat and drink as cognitively intact individuals. For most of us here, if it's 1 o'clock and we haven't eaten lunch, we're thinking about it. If you have Alzheimer's, you may not even recognize that the feelings you're having are hunger. That, and people can just forget and think, I've already eaten, and really turn things down. So as caregivers, we have to be really creative and constantly pushing food and almost more importantly, water in order to prevent urinary tract infections and other types of issues. Another unique situation, I think, for persons with dementia is those living alone who engage in what we call self-neglect. And I think that those are probably the most difficult situations we face, is when someone says, no, I'm fine. Leave me alone, I'm doing okay. And you see them with piles of newspaper, you've seen pictures maybe of people who, what they call hoard. And that can happen, certainly it's more common in people with cognitive impairments, where they are just about barricaded in their homes. Very dangerous situation, very difficult to remedy, especially if people continually refuse assistance. Because unless they're conserved, it's going to be hard for you to just go in and handle that situation. So that's something that we try to work very closely and keep a close eye on people who live alone who have dementia. Inadequate clothing certainly is an issue. One of the things that, in my opinion, can be neglected is that issue of wandering that I mentioned. We had a situation years ago in Berkeley of a gentleman who wandered repeatedly. Now we have a wanderer's identification program. It's a bracelet, kind of like Medical Alert. And so you could see that he needed assistance and call the 800 number. It's not a tracking device. It's not the answer to the problem of wandering, but it's helpful if the person's found, then they can be identified. Well, he was wandering, he'd go 3 miles one day, and then the police would pick him up and they'd bring him home, and the next week he'd go 3 miles again in another direction, and this continued. Even though we were talking with the family saying, this is not okay. And the daughter said, well, he needs his freedom. We don't want to restrict his activity. He used to be a postal worker, and he needs to walk. And so we let him walk. Now, what's the problem with that? It's dangerous, right? So what ended up happening, he was hit by a car while he was wandering, and he broke his nose. It could have been much worse than that. But then the family put him in a locked unit. Go from complete freedom at home, come and go as you want, to locked facility. There's a whole lot of steps in the middle there that we could have done and not had to have that drastic a situation. So in my opinion, that was neglect on the part of that family. Now, would it have held up, in court? I'm not sure about that, but the family needed to supervise him, and it was putting him in harm's way. So this can be a little more subtle, I think. They're not always as clear-cut as you think. There are these gray areas. Untreated medical conditions, for example. People with Alzheimer's sometimes refuse to do things like take medications. So if the caregiver is unsuccessful, is she or he neglecting that person? Well, you need to find out more, wouldn't you, in terms of what are they doing to try to address the medical situation. Let's go on to the next one. I understand you talked about financial abuse already. One example I alluded to earlier that we came across was a husband who was giving away all of the family savings. And in this case, it wasn't an elder, so this is kind of interesting. What do you do when you have someone who is under age 65 who has a neurological disease? You don't refer them to APS, right? Because they have to be an elder in order to qualify. But nevertheless, this gentleman gave away the entire family fortune, and they could not get him conserved because he could pull it together well enough in front of a judge so that the judge wouldn't go for it. More often what we're doing is working with families around getting power of attorney early and having it be someone they trust, because it's the abuse of power of attorney that can go awry too. We see things like the individual is being denied care because the family wants to preserve the assets. Their access to the outside world is restricted. Now in Alzheimer's, a lot of times the caregiver and the person with Alzheimer's are isolated. That is one of the most common things that happens, is that they become cut off from the outside world, not because they want to be. But there are also instances where, you've heard this saying, I think, the black sheep on the white horse syndrome. Have you ever heard of that? Where there'll be a child in the area who hasn't really been associated so much with the family, but when dad develops Alzheimer's, I'm here to save the day, and I'm the only one who can do this. Have you seen that before? Yes, I love that image of the black sheep on the white horse. I'm here. And that can be a real issue where they isolate the individual from the other family members, and a lot of times this goes hand in hand with the financial abuse, that isolation and then controlling the finances. So we're very suspicious. We get interesting calls, you might imagine, sometimes about siblings suing one another because this person's doing that and this person's doing that, and way too common. Additional forms of abuse. The one that we see the most on this is resident-to-resident abuse. So in the last couple of minutes that I have, I want to talk a little bit about that. So what I mean is in residential care and in nursing homes, when there is an altercation between individuals who live there. And I heard a very interesting talk at a conference in Chicago. It was by an attorney who had done a literature review on this and found that the most common time for a person to be the victim of resident-to-resident abuse is in the first 24 hours after admission, when they are rooming with someone who is cognitively intact. And it's the person who's cognitively intact who is aggressive towards the individual with cognitive impairment. So you can kind of picture that, can't you? If you think about a situation where you've had the room to yourself, you're cognitively intact, they put another person in there who is confused, they've just moved in, so they're very confused, and they go through your things all the time, and they start taking things, and it's that kind of scenario that can lead to abuse. It can also be where you have two cognitively impaired residents who get into it. When I was doing work in a nursing home, I witnessed what, thank God, didn't end up coming to fruition, but what I saw was there was an elderly woman who had had strokes, and so she would constantly talk, but never really say anything. So she would say 6666666, 777. 7, and she'd be very intent. Okay, come on, you can get this. And she'd be trying to communicate it, and no one would be able to communicate with her. And what she would do is move furniture all day. She was constantly moving it around, and not everybody enjoyed that particular behavior that she had. And so she was moving a piece of furniture, and there was one very physically fit gentleman with Alzheimer's, and she decided she was going to move something of his, and he didn't like it, and he picked up a chair that was really heavy. I don't think I could have lifted it. I mean, I could lift it. It would be one where you'd have to lift it like this. And he lifted it up over his head and was about to land it on her head when a staff member came out and stopped it and diffused it. That's what we're talking about. Those kinds of things happen not infrequently. Resident-to-resident aggression. And I was talking with Peggy earlier, and she gave an example of a situation where a person died from being punched. And you have to report that. For those of you who are staff working in long-term care, you have to report those instances. And I know people hate it because they think, but they're both cognitively impaired. And yet what we need to look at is the situation. Well, how did this happen, and how can we prevent it from happening? But that's, I think, a really, really tricky area. So let's go on to the next slide, and then we'll, since we only have 5 minutes left. So as you've heard me say prevention probably 50 times so far, that's really our focus, is to help people avoid getting into trouble, get the services they need, get the training, get help from people when you need it. Identifying and assessing the situation. Way too often I come across professionals who do not want to report because they just think, oh, it's going to hurt my relationship with the individual. And I get that. But unfortunately, it's pretty clear what you need to do in these situations, regardless of how you feel about it. And so we really work with providers to identify situations and label them when they are abuse. This is abuse, and we need to take steps to intervene. Intervention as early as possible, and then, of course, reporting it. That's what we have to do. And then addressing chronic situations. I think APS does a good job in our area, and it's a tough job to do. And unfortunately, I think they end up having to focus on the worst of the worst situations sometimes. But dealing with those situations to get resources in is probably the best approach. So let's go to the next slide, and then we'll finish up. So these are some of the things that we look at. Are there other family members who can help? And is anybody asking them to help? Because a lot of times people don't ask. Is jail appropriate? Now that might be an aha experience there to see that. But we have been in situations where the gentleman I mentioned before who killed his wife, he is in jail. What else are they going to do in that situation? They're looking at, actually, I believe he's in a psychiatric ward. I think they call it for the criminally insane or something horrible like that. Not a great solution, is it? And yet, what else? Our system is not set up to handle this. When someone commits a crime like that, it's a no-win situation for everyone involved. Really awful. So we do work with lawyers, and sometimes we'll get involved in cases to try to figure out what's the best solution here. Sometimes it's important for the person to be held. I'm going to skip down a little bit in terms of mental health hold, a 5150 where they're temporarily held, and that can be a real struggle to have them hold the person. We had a woman who was brandishing a butcher knife against her husband, the caregiver, and she had Alzheimer's, and the police took her in, and the hospital admitted her, and then as soon as the attending physician saw that she was on a psychiatric unit, he discharged her home. She was just as agitated as she had been before. So they sent her home to this elderly caregiver and said, good luck with that. No other resources were given to this family. These are the challenges that we face. So rallying community resources. Well, let me talk a little bit more about frontal temporal lobe dementia. But see, the trick there is that strokes, remember I mentioned that the symptoms that go along with a stroke depend on where it's located. So if you had a stroke in the front part of your brain, you could have some of those same symptoms as a person with frontotemporal lobe dementia. Well, one of the things I'd want to make sure is that they ruled out that the person doesn't have frontotemporal lobe dementia. It's hard to find that one, because think about it, if someone's in their 40s and 50s, they're not thinking dementia, right? They're thinking psychiatric, maybe stroke, other things like that. So I would want to be sure that that is addressed, because if it is frontotemporal lobe dementia, the best treatment is antidepressants, in particular SSRIs, which are common antidepressant medications, and those have been found to be most helpful. So it might be worthwhile just talking to the physician about that as an option. I don't know if that's helpful in a person who's had a stroke. The hard thing is that if it is caused by a stroke or frontal lobe dementia, what's going to have to change? Are they going to be able to change? No. You're not going to be able to teach someone that what they said was hurtful and to not say it anymore. Instead, you're going to have to help educate people around them to have a thick skin, which is a really hard thing to do, isn't it? So anyway, I'd be happy to talk with you more about that situation. I think we have to stop now, but thank you all for your attention. I really appreciate it.
Elizabeth, you provided terrific information in a very clear, compact sort of way, and we really, really appreciate you being here. So let's thank her once more, and then we'll take a 15-minute break.